Greetings, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to review a portion of a debate that I heard from Paulogia. So here we go. This is hopefully being shared.
Nothing at this point.
Samuel, are you sure it's not anything on your end? Don't worry, I
No.
paused the clock, Paul.
Okay.
Things here, so let's.
Because
Yeah,
I
now I
can
hear
hear.
Paul. Now I hear Paul. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Were
Gotcha.
you able to hear me though, James?
I only until the end of the two stipulations.
Okay. I'll go back. So
Okay,
Right.
I'll give you extra time, so no
Okay.
problem.
Sounds good. So what we're looking for today, I'll just step back for a second, is the historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And of course, unfortunately, unlike math, history doesn't ever prove what happened. History only describes what probably happened and gives a relative weight, sort of relative certainty to the claims that history even makes. And that certainty is always apportioned to several things, including the evidence at hand. So stronger evidence is given more weight than weaker evidence. The conventionality of the claim is considered. So, for example, it would take less evidence for me to convince you that Abraham Lincoln had a horse than it might take for if I wanted to try and prove that Abraham Lincoln was a vampire hunter, for example. The conventionality of the claim comes into play. And all things being equal, in history, the amount of time that has passed also plays a factor. So something that took, all things being equal, if something took place further back in history, we're less certain of it than something that took place now. And unfortunately, that's just the way history works. These are just the realities of the historical method. Now, if Jesus rose from the dead, it obviously would be a miracle. And in history, by definition, a miracle would have to be the least probable explanation. If we're talking about something like rising from the dead, where natural laws would have to be suspended and a supernatural being of some sort would have to intervene, that is, by definition, the least probable explanation. Now, this isn't some kind of weird historical naturalism where history says there can't be a supernatural or there can't be miracles. All it says is that history, unfortunately, can't say that something was a miracle. It can't ascribe something to a miracle because, by definition, as I said, it's the least likely. So any evidence for a miracle would have to overcome that tremendous burden of being the lowest probability event. And anytime you even have a mundane explanation, history would have to say that that mundane explanation by default is actually more likely than the historical one, given all things being equal. So what are these facts that history wants to explain? Well, given that I've already said that Jesus lived and that Jesus died, I've granted those, in my opinion, and I know Samuel had a few other points that he felt were facts, and I'll talk about those. In my opinion, we really only have one fact that needs explaining, and that is that people said that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, unfortunately, that puts us in the realm of testimony, and I'm sure everyone listening has heard time before where they've heard stories about how testimony is not the best way of getting evidence, and it's unreliable. Memories can be changed, memories can be affected, witnesses can be led, all those kind of things. But it's what we have. So we need to talk about that. So if you have eyewitness testimony, what would you want? Well, obviously you would want firsthand testimony is best. It's better than secondhand, third-hand hearsay. You'd want contemporary evidence. You'd want it to be within the time frame of what's happening. Ideally, you would like multiple accounts. Obviously, more accounts would be better than fewer accounts. You'd want those accounts to be independent of each other. So, for example, if I was to tell my three children a story, and my three children went off and told other people, they are not three sources all of a sudden for this account. It all came from me. There was really only one source there. While you want the testimony to be independent, you also want it to corroborate. You want the stories to back each other up. You want the details to match up. And lastly, you would really ultimately want someone who's unbiased. You want your testimony to come from someone without skin in the game, who doesn't actually care one way or the other how things go. So most people, and as Samuel said, he looks at the Gospels and he believes the Gospels. Most people take the Gospels as their primary source for why Jesus rose from the dead. So what kind of sources are these? Well, unfortunately, even though they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are actually anonymous books. The authors of those books did not sign them. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came centuries later out of various traditions based on some ideas. But if we want to talk about that, we can. But they're anonymous. The authors don't say that. And also, even worse, the authors don't even claim to be eyewitnesses. Nowhere in the Gospels does it say, I saw this or I saw that. So these are not, this doesn't pass the firsthand criteria. Are they contemporary? Well, while there's some dispute, most scholars come around the fact that the first gospel written, Mark, was written around 65 AD, which is unfortunately a lifetime after the event. There's, if you look at the latest scholarship based on life expectancy in the first century Rome, it's around 20 to 30 years. So 30 years, 60 years afterwards, that's a full lifetime after the event. And a quick fun fact, the original Gospel of Mark actually has no post-resurrection appearances of any kind. The original ending of Mark just ends with the empty tomb and the women promising to be silent and nothing after that. These sources are not independent of each other. Mark was written first. It's the shortest book. We know for a fact that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. In fact, 97% of Mark is in Matthew, 88% of Mark is in Luke, and sometimes they are copied verbatim, word for word in the original Greek. So we know that these are not independent sources. And recent scholarship by Richard Bachheim and others even attest that John would utilize Mark when it was writing. One quick example, when the two books use the same stories, they're in exactly the same order, John and Mark, without variation, unlike Matthew and Luke, which felt free to jumble stories. It's a little bit too coincidental for it not to have been there. So, and I'm not going to give all these corroboration examples, but we know for a fact that the Gospels also don't line up on all the details. So the one example I will stick with is, did Jesus die before or after the Passover? It seems like it can't be both. But the Synoptic Gospels say that Jesus died after the Passover, whereas John says that he died before the Passover. And why did John do that? Well, John wanted to make a point in his whole gospel. His whole gospel is about how Jesus is the Passover lamb. So naturally, he needed Jesus to die before the Passover. So he changed it for a theological reason. And all the gospels are theological books. They're not unbiased. They all had a point of view. They very much cared about this. So what if we go to the extra biblical? Well, in terms of extra biblical, there actually is none. We have no eyewitnesses that say they saw Jesus that aren't from the Bible. At best, what we have is external sources that are reporting what was believed about Jesus, not exactly what happened. And for time, I'm going to skip the zombie story, but I may come back to that. It seems like something that should be extra biblical. A lot of people point to circumstantial evidence. They say, well, the church exists, so therefore Jesus must have been raised. Well, obviously, we know that many churches rise. It's a mundane claim that your church rose and faced persecution. I mean, this does not require a supernatural event. We know that. So that's a mundane explanation. No one would die for a lie. Well, we just had the anniversary of 9/11. We know that people will die for a lie. I know that a lot of Christians will say, well, people won't die if they know it was a lie. Well, we do know that we have examples of that as well. And I will also probably talk a little bit more about how we even know, did any of the apostles actually die? Or we know they died, but how did they die? And did they recant? And could they have saved their lives or made their lives better if they recanted? Maybe they did recant. We don't actually have any of that. But let's get quickly to the main source that I think we all agree is the best source, and that is Paul. Now, Paul is the only person in the New Testament who says his name and says that he saw Jesus alive. He's the only one. The problem with Paul is he didn't see physical Jesus. Paul saw a vision. If you look at the accounts in Acts in chapters 9 and chapter 22, Paul's companions didn't see who Paul was talking to. They didn't see anyone. If there was a physical body there, they would have seen him. This happened after the ascension into heaven. Jesus was in heaven already. It seems unlikely that he reaffirmed his physical body, came down for a quick cameo to Paul. If so, that's not in the same realm of raising from the dead. That's a whole different being. And he walks through walls, all those kind of things. But we also know in Paul's letters, he continues to describe all of his revelations as visions. He uses the word visions. Paul knows that he saw what he would call a vision, we would call a hallucination, which again is a very mundane claim. We know hallucinations happen.
Paul, just letting you know you have 2 minutes and 35 seconds.
Perfect. Well, then I have better than I needed. Okay, so the first Corinthians 15 creed, which has already been mentioned. We'll talk about it a little more, I'm sure, in the cross, but it is a creed. It is essentially a nursery rhyme. It is a rhyme. It's a statement that was made that tells Paul what other people believed. This is not something that Paul can attest to. This is merely something that Paul is repeating from other people. Again, so this more than 500 claim, it's the only place it happened, but it's essentially, it's in this rhyme. So again, this creed is simply what was believed at the time, not an eyewitness as to what happened. So did anyone actually witness a resurrected Jesus? Well, there's three possibilities. Yes, some of them maybe did, and they were telling the truth. Again, history would have a hard time saying so, but it's possible that some of them are telling the truth and saw Jesus alive. There's another possible answer is no, they didn't, and everyone is lying about it. Well, that seems a little conspiracy theorist, but it is certainly a possible answer. The answer that I think happened is that no one saw Jesus, but in fact, they were mistaken. We know that people are mistaken all the time. Their minds play tricks on them. They can convince themselves of things. Being mistaken is a very mundane claim. And again, a mundane claim is always going to be preferable to the impossible miracle claim. Not the impossible miracle claim, but the lowest percentage miracle claim. So in conclusion, I feel there's insufficient evidence to say that Jesus rose from the dead. Miracles are the least possible historical idea. The supernatural claims we do have are from very problematic sources. Mundane solutions have extremely adequate explanatory power, so therefore the resurrection does not meet the burden of proof of historicity.
Okay, so that was a very interesting take on the resurrection and on a lot of the information that we have. I am switching my screens right now, so just hold on for just a second here so I can go back to see where everyone is. Hold on. Okay, so we're going to go back to the live streaming area. Good, there we are. And I can see Stephen Steen and Jim Majors. And I want to say thank you to both of you for coming by. I want to also say thank you for the shout out on Twitter. So I really appreciate that. So Paulogia made the assertion that we have no firsthand accounts of Jesus's resurrection since the authors of the Gospels did not self-identify. He further stated that the Gospels are anonymous and no one attributed them to the four named authors for, quote, centuries. Let it be noted that no one attributed the Gospels to anyone else in ancient history, and we have early attributions in the 2nd century. For example, around 180 AD, in Against Heresies and Church History, Irenaeus stated that Matthew wrote a gospel for the Hebrews in their own language, while Paul and Peter were in Rome sharing the good news. Prior to that, around 130 AD, the Bishop of Hierapolis referenced Mark and Matthew in his expositions of the Logia of the Lord. Here's what he said. He said, the elder also said this, Mark being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered, he wrote accurately, but not, however, in the order that these things were spoken or done by our Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterwards, as I said, he was with Peter, who did not make a complete or ordered account of the Lord's Logia, but constructed his teachings according to Sharai. So Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single matters as he remembered him, for he gave special attention to one thing, of not passing by anything he heard and not falsifying anything in these matters. Concerning Mark, these things were related by the Father, and that's John the Elder. Concerning Matthew, these other things were said. Therefore, Matthew set in order the Logia, divine oracles, in a Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted as he was able. Other early support for the four named gospel authors comes from Tertullian, Tatian, the canon Muratorius, and Origen. Paulogia further stated that we have no contemporary accounts, yet 1 Corinthians 15, 1-11, which even skeptics like Paul admit was a creed early Christians memorized between 3 and 5 years of Jesus' resurrection, refutes this assertion. Some of the 500 were still living when Paul recorded 1 Corinthians 15 prior to his martyrdom around 62. So they could have refuted his writings if they were not true. We have no record of any ancient refutations of Paul's works. Here's what 1 Corinthians 15, 1-11 states. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel, you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you would have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as one abnormally born. Now note that Paul did not say he appeared to me in a vision. He didn't say he appeared to me in a hallucination. He said he appeared to me, and he put himself on the exact same level as the others who had seen. Paulogia pointed to similarities between the synoptics to assert they are not independent, yet he paradoxically capitalized on differences to suggest we don't have corroboration between them. He suggested that John is also borrowing from Mark by claiming some verses are ordered in the same way in two books. One explanation may be that the verses are chronological, yet we would need the specific verses to check that explanation. Paul never specified the particular verses. He further pointed to the early ending of Mark at 16:8 to claim that when the book ended, no one knew Jesus had resurrected. Paul must have missed this verse from Mark 16:6-7. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Paulogia suggested the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke may have been sourced from a single source, known as Q or Quell, or the authors may have borrowed from one another. Either way, we have multiple attestations. No one is claiming the synoptics are authored by the same person. Furthermore, other books of the New Testament are authored independently. Even if we only had one single gospel, or two, combining the synoptics plus John, we have an attestation of Jesus's ministry, resurrection, and divinity. Even if we only had Paul's writings, we'd have enough of a testimony of Jesus' ministry, resurrection, and divinity. Even if we only had extra biblical sources, we'd have enough of a testimony to Jesus' ministry and the beliefs from the apostles that he resurrected and is divine. Here's what we have, and this is according to Habermas and Lacona. We have 9 traditional sources of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, the author of Hebrews, James, Peter, and Jude. We have 20 early Christian writings outside of the New Testament: Clement of Rome, Second Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp, Barnabas, Didache, Shepherd of Hermas, fragments of Papias, Justin Martyr, Aristides, Athenagoras, Theophilus of Antioch, Quadratus, Aristo of Pella, Melito of Sardis, Diognetus, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, and Epistula Apostolorum. We have 4 heretical writings: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, and the Treatise on the Resurrection. And we have 9 secular non-Christian sources: Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Phlegon, Lucian, Celsus, Suetonius, and Thales, and Mara bar Serapion. I have detailed the writings by these people in my blog, and you can go visit it at christian-apologist.com. Paul made other claims. He said, we have eyewitnesses, and I will answer that. He said, we had no eyewitnesses. I say, we have eyewitnesses in Matthew, the tax collector, John, Jesus's beloved apostle, Peter, his rock, James, Jesus's half-brother, and Jude, Jesus's other half-brother. We further have Paul, who authored between 6 and 13 books of the New Testament. As pointed out by Samuel Nissan, whom I thought did a fine job debating Paulogia, by the way, as pointed out, Peter's testimony is written by Luke in Acts 5:32. Peter says, we are witnesses of these things, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him. Additionally, Luke traveled with Paul, as noted when he referred to himself in the first person, starting in Acts 16. Luke further started the Gospel of Luke with his testimony that he collected an orderly, meticulous account. Paul also met with Peter and James, Jesus' half-brother. In other words, the New Testament contains contemporary references to Jesus, eyewitness authors, and those who knew the eyewitness authors and apostles. Paulogia further suggested what he deemed to be a contradiction in the timing of Jesus' crucifixion between John's account and the Synoptics' account. John's account uses the Judean system of timing, while the Synoptics use the Galilean, so this is not a contradiction. According to Hayner, 1977, the Galilean method of reckoning the timing of the Passover runs from sunrise to sunrise. So using the Galilean method, Nisan 14 began at sunrise on Thursday, and Nisan 15 began at sunrise on Friday. The Galilean method was used by the Pharisees, and the Synoptics used this reckoning. John used the Judean method of reckoning, in which Nisan 14 began at sunset on Thursday night and ended at sunset on Friday night. The Judean method was used by the Sadducees. The Synoptic Reckoning places the slaughter of the Passover lamb on Thursday between 3 and 5 p.m., while the Judean Reckoning places the slaughter of the Passover lamb on Friday between 3 and 5 p.m. Here may be a case in point where neither party, Pharisees or Sadducees, compromised, so there were 2 days of Passover slaughter, according to Hayner. These differences can also help explain what appear to be discrepancies in the timing of Jesus' appearance before Pontius Pilate, as reported in Mark 15:25 and John 19:14. Mark's day used a Jewish 24-hour time period, so the third hour when Jesus was crucified was 3 hours after the morning began at 6 a.m. John's day used the Roman time period, so the 6th hour when Jesus appeared before Pilate would be 6 hours after midnight at 6 a.m. Taken together, the Gospels report that Jesus appeared before Pilate around 6 a.m., he was crucified at 9 a.m., and darkness appeared between noon and 3 p.m. when he died. He was buried after that on Friday. In the larger context, these findings indicate the apostles ate the Last Supper on Thursday, followed by the crucifixion of Jesus on Friday, the Sabbath Saturday, and of course the discovery by the women of the empty tomb on Sunday. Jesus had predicted that in John 2:19 and Mark 14:58, by the way. Paulogia further made the assertion that Paul only witnessed either a hallucination or vision of Jesus. Yet again, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refuted Paulogia's assertions. In 1 Corinthians 15:12-22, here's what he said. He said, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man." Also note that mass hallucinations are impossible. Hallucinations are like dreams, only in a single person's brain. Just as people do not share dreams, people do not share mass hallucinations. So that hypothesis is ruled out. Paulogia suggested that the accounts we have of Jesus' resurrection were biased. Yet how logical is it to suggest a mere bias would be compelling enough to preach for Jesus decades despite massive and gory persecution? And despite what some skeptics claim, gory persecution and martyrdoms were common in ancient times. We have support biblically and extra-biblically for the martyrdoms of the apostles and many early Christians. In the New Testament, numerous reports by authors such as Luke and Paul document early Christian persecution. Acts 7:54-60 documents the stoning of Stephen, while Acts 12:2 documents the way Herod Agrippa put James, the brother of John, to death by the sword. Paul was also stoned, jailed, beaten when he documented his New Testament books. His beheading by Nero was documented by Origen, Tertullian, and Dionysius of Corinth. The martyrdom of Jesus' half-brother James was documented by Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. Peter was crucified upside down, as confirmed by Eusebius, the first church historian, in his book Ecclesiastical History, and also by Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, and Origen. Other accounts of the deaths of the disciples are based on tradition. So these other accounts include things like Matthew suffered martyrdom in Ethiopia. He was killed by a sword. Bartholomew was flayed to death by a whip. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. The cross is now known as the Cross of St. Andrew. Thomas was stabbed with a spear in India. Paul was tortured and beheaded by Nero, again, as I mentioned. James the Lesser was either beaten or stoned to death while praying for his attackers. Philip was reportedly crucified upside down in Hierapolis, Turkey. And Matthias reportedly preached in the land of the cannibals. Jesus' apostles were not the only ones to be persecuted. And I'll quote this: "The first Christian martyrs to be thrown to the wild beasts died in the arena of the Colosseum. And because of these martyrs, who succeeded the gladiators, the Colosseum was venerated greatly during the Middle Ages. It was considered to be a monument consecrated to the martyrdom of the early Christians. Only for that reason was it saved, and for the same reason the vast structure, partially in ruins but still impressive in character, is still revered by many in the civilized world." This is from an academic article by Rutledge in 1940. Another article by Caristaies in 1968 states this: "Immediately after registering Marcus Aurelius' succession to Antonius Pius in 161 AD, Eusebius reports that, at the time discussed, there was great persecutions in Asia, and that Polycarp was one of the martyrs of these persecutions. Before telling the story of Polycarp's arrest, torture, and execution, Eusebius makes references to the other martyrs with a summary characterization and some gory details of the barbarous treatment of these victims in this round of anti-Christian violence in Smyrna. For Polycarp was the 12th martyr in this city, all other martyrs being from Philadelphia. Apart from Polycarp, Eusebius mentions only one other martyr by name, Germanicus. And then here's another quote by Thompson in 2002 from another academic article. According to the martyrdom of Polycarp, it was a noonday crowd at the Colosseum that reacted with uncontrollable wrath when Bishop Polycarp confessed to being a Christian. They first cried out to Philip the Asiarch to let the lion loose on Polycarp, but Philip could not do that, for the morning hunts were closed. Then the crowd cried out with one mind that he should burn Polycarp alive. Polycarp gazed directly at the crowd as he said, "Away with the atheists." That was just a term that they used for people who were not Christians. He was soon burned at the stake. And Mark Thompson also says, among the martyrs at Lyons was Sanctus, whose body bore witness to his sufferings, being all one bruise and one wound, stretched and distorted out of any recognizably human shape. But Christ's suffering in him achieved great glory, overwhelming the adversary and showing as an example to all the others that nothing is to be feared where the Father's love is, nothing painful where we find Christ's glory. The slave girl Blandina, after being tortured, was hung on a post and exposed as food for the wild beasts that were let loose on her. She seemed to hang there in the form of a cross, and with her physical eyes, they, the other martyrs, saw in the person of their sister, him who was crucified for them. Roman Emperor Decius instituted what was considered to be the first organized persecution of Christians. He reigned between 201 and 251 throughout the Roman Empire. Prior to Decius, persecutions of Christians had been more sporadic and local. Decius required that all citizens to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods and the well-being of the emperor in the presence of a Roman magistrate. The magistrate then issued a signed and witnessed certificate. Refusal to make this sacrifice resulted in the martyrdom of some Christians, such as Babylas of Antioch, Alexander of Jerusalem, and Pope Fabian. Others, such as Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, went into hiding. The next emperor, Gallienus, paid less attention to Christianity, so the laws went into abeyance. They were resurrected again with Diocletian, who came into office in 284. In 303, emperors Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius issued a series of edicts that rescinded Christians' legal rights and required compliance with traditional pagan religious services. That ended when Constantine came into office in 306 AD. Constantine restored Christians to full legal equality and returned property to them that had been confiscated. In 313 AD, he signed the Edict of Milan, which offered Christians a comprehensive acceptance. Constantine himself converted to Christianity when he had a vision of a Christian symbol, which helped him to win a battle and his seat as the Roman emperor. Thank God for Constantine. Some skeptics have argued that early Christian disciples were mistaken, delusional, or were profiting from Christianity in some material way. Paul, of course, said they were mistaken in his debate there. Yet they failed to consider basic psychology. They also failed to consider the early disciples reaped no material rewards. We have no indication that they were not of sound minds. They were martyred for their beliefs, yet they were in the position to know whether their beliefs were true. For this reason, comparing them to modern day martyrs, such as the 9/11 hijackers, is faulty. Muslim extremists believe what others told them, not what they saw. No Muslims have seen Allah. The Quran states that quite clearly. Consider the following. 1, people of sound mind make decisions to maximize their outcomes. 2, people of sound mind weigh benefits against drawbacks when making decisions. 3, early Christians wanted to maximize their chances of going to heaven by following Jesus. 4, early Christians weighed the benefits of going to heaven and following Jesus against the risks of imprisonment and death. And 5, had early Christians determined the risks outweighed the benefits and considered it all a lie, they would have recanted their testimonies in support of Jesus. Furthermore, Jesus' chosen disciples speak to his miracles. If I were going to start a new club or a new business, I would want to enlist the help of powerful and influential people. I would want support from people who had the highest visibility and greatest money needed to help me get the word out. Rather than choose the powerful Pharisees, politicians, or other leaders, Jesus chose the weak. He chose fishermen, a tent maker, a tax collector, and others. He healed prostitutes, forgave adulterers, and elevated women and children. Women who were considered second-class citizens during Jesus' time were the first to make the most important discovery in the gospel of the empty tomb. He went against people's expectations. Rather than appear with power, glory, and majesty, he appeared in a manger. Rather than work as an earthly king, he worked as a humble carpenter. Rather than rub elbows with the Pharisees, who were considered the most devout followers of God, he rubbed elbows with the sinners. Rather than call on his followers to do great works, he has called on us to have faith in him. No other religions are like Christianity, which is the way, the truth, and the life. In conclusion, the claims that Paulogia suggested that Jesus' disciples were mistaken are without merit, so we can thank God for that. Now I'm going to look in the chat and see if there's any questions. I still see Jim and Stephen Steen. Looks like they're going back and forth here. And I'm going to see, does anyone have any questions, thoughts, anything you'd like to comment on? Jim is an Arian. Is this what I'm seeing? Okay, maybe we don't have questions or thoughts, or maybe I'm running a few minutes ahead. So what I'm going to do is I want to say, again, this was from the Modern Day Debate channel. It was a great debate that was with Paulogia representing the atheist and another person whose name I'm forgetting all of a sudden. So I will go back and look, Samuel Nissan representing the Christian. Samuel, again, did a fantastic job. I'm going to include a link in the description here to the Modern Day Debate video so that you can go back and watch the entire debate. And Stephen Steen says he won the debate against Jim. Excellent. Great, Stephen. I'm going to go back and also look at the chat. So I'm sure I missed a lot. So I really appreciate that all of you came by. Jim had thoughts, but no real questions. So Jim, would you like to share one of your thoughts? Maybe he just is. I will have to probably do another stream to figure out what any questions about my thoughts about it. Okay, so you know what? I think I'm going to have to go and find something that Jim has posted so I can do a refutation to him. Maybe that'll be next. Maybe Stephen Steen would be willing to come on and with Jim. Maybe we can all get on a channel and duke this out. So it could be really a lot of fun. And also I want to say thank you to Susan also for stopping by. So Stephen didn't think that Paulogia's arguments were very strong. I'm going to have to agree with Stephen Steen. So thank you again, everybody. Please like and subscribe and come again. I'm trying to build my channel up. On Monday, I'm going to be interviewing an atheist who calls himself Adam Paradox. And so Monday, that's going to appear. So I hope you'll be willing to come by and listen to that. It's going to be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I listened to Adam Paradox's video response to my 8 questions that I say atheists cannot plausibly answer. And I didn't find his responses terribly compelling, but you probably guessed that. Of course, I probably have somewhat of a bias, but we'll just have to deal with that. So thank you so much. Please come again.